Friends, here we are today with one of the major figures in the history of the Hispanic, Latino, Latina communities in the United States, Professor Dr. Justo Gonzalez, who has prepared the way for many of us to be where we are. And Dr. Gonzalez, we are very happy to have you in this interview. Thank you very much. So, can you tell us a little bit about your trajectory? How, when you look back now, how you see your movement and how God has brought you this far?
Well, that's a very big question.
Yes.
I mean, you want me to summarize 76 years in 76 seconds. But I grew up in Cuba. I grew up as a Protestant. Both my parents were leaders in the Methodist Church. Both were ordained. And frankly, my trajectory has been very easy. So I cannot tell all the horrible stories that so many of my friends can tell about the difficulties. My parents were not well-to-do, but my mother was the director of a very good school for the well-to-do, and so my brother and I got to go for free. My mother was a professor of literature, my father was the editor of a newspaper and a novelist. So Catherine, my wife, says that instead of blood I have printer's ink. So writing again is just something that comes very, very easily. Actually, she also says sometimes I have not had an unpublished thought, and I retort that I have had many a published unthought. But I grew up in Cuba, went to seminary there, and then as I was finishing, again, not my doing, but the cabinet and the bishop, I'm a Methodist, and you know, the Methodists are supposed to do what the bishops are supposed to. But anyhow, they decided I should go and study, and so I came to study in the States, went to Yale. And just as I was finishing at Yale, the CIA invaded Cuba, and you had the famous Bay of Pigs, or Playa Girón invasion, which made it impossible for anybody at that point who was in the U.S. to go back and work there. So I went to Puerto Rico. And in Puerto Rico I was for 8 years. And again, I was just planning to teach, but a professor of mine at Yale wrote to the president of the seminary and told him that he thought I should spend time writing, not just teaching. And so this president went and got some money, which he needed because the seminary had no money to pay my salary. So I was sort of forced to start writing. It wasn't any kind of thing that I planned to do. So again, I say it's been very, very, things, God has just been guiding me in ways that in some ways I find unique in that I have very little to complain about. Then, obviously, when I was in the States, I began having the experience that a lot of us have of being discriminated in minor ways. Nobody ever would prohibit me from doing anything, but I knew if I walked into a store, somebody was always walking behind me to see what I was doing, or if I was anywhere until I opened my mouth and said what I was doing, everybody just thought that I was, they didn't care what I was doing at all. And so it was a bit of that, but not a whole lot. And then I came from Puerto Rico to the States, and eventually I began working much more with the Latino community in this country. And again, it was not my doing. At some point, I got this phone call that a foundation was interested in doing some work for Latinos, but they would only do it if I did a certain study on Latina theological education. So I went and did that, and out of that developed basically 3 things, or some others, but especially the Hispanic Summer Program, which is where we are now, and the Hispanic Theological Initiative, which is a program that promotes scholarship among Latinos and Latinas, and particularly PhD students and professors and so on, and the Association for Hispanic Theological Education, which is an organization that includes everybody and tries to be very inclusive and tries to work precisely with connecting various levels of theological education. So my own career has been very, very easy in that sense. Now, obviously, there's a sense in which at some points I have had to, there's a sense in which at some points I've had to sort of adjust things, just like you're having to adjust things right now.
Exactly.
But it hasn't been all that difficult. It has been much clearer to me as I began working with other Latinas and Latinos, the degree of discrimination which they suffered. Discrimination in very real, prohibitive ways, but also in some ways a more insidious and painful discrimination than it's just sort of an undertone that people don't expect you to do much, that if you do something people are surprised, that you are there, and sometimes they figure that if you're there it's because you're Latino, somebody gave you some privilege because it's some kind of affirmative action, so they had to put you there so to make things look good for them. And that I experience all the time with many of my colleagues, especially younger generations that are trying to come up. So my own career has been very, very smooth. I would say that I have been more pushed to do things than I have pushed to do them.
Mm-hmm. Right. So. What were the influences that shaped you, both personally but also intellectually?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, everybody knows, and usually the normal thing is my parents, my family. Again, as I said, I grew up in a place where writing was more common than eating. It was constantly. So there was that influence in which brought a love for language and a love for the debate and thinking and all that. That was very much the house that we grew up with. Then in seminary, there were several professors who were very, very influential. None of them became a sort of a role model, but all of them were pieces of a role model. My professor of church history was an ex-Roman Catholic priest who had been a secretary to the cardinal and who was very traditional in his approach to everything. So church history was something you got to learn. But still, his knowledge and his use of the languages to read the text was very, very influential to me. There were several other professors like that. Then I went to Yale, and there I was very much influenced by several church historians. I mean, the man whose book I had read and translated years before, Kenneth Scott Latourette, was my next door neighbor. Actually, his office was right next door to mine, so he never was my teacher, but we spent hours talking and walking around, and he liked to go for walks, so we go out and walk and talk. Then Roland Bainton was my major professor, he and George Lindbeck. And both of them were very, very influential. Lindbeck much more in the academic side of tough scholarship, and Bainton much more in the literary, emotional side. When Bainton lectured on Augustine, at the end of his lecture, people were crying, and so was he. And so that was another way of doing academics that was not very common, especially at a place like Yale. While I was at Yale, I took a year off to go to Europe, and I was able to study some with Carvalhaes, and that was obviously quite an influence. Mm-hmm. I read about him, I read of him, and read his material and admire him, but it was very good to be able to just sit with him and talk about all kinds of issues. So those have been mostly the main influences of living people right next to me. Good. But you see, I'm a historian, so I spend all my time talking with Irenaeus and others. But I think the two that have most shaped me are probably Irenaeus and Athanasius. And obviously I've done quite a bit on others, Augustine and Luther and Calvin, a whole lot of Wesley. But I think if I were to say what makes me look at things differently, I think it's mostly Irenaeus and Athanasius.
Wow. And from those influences, Dr. Gonzalez, how would you describe the Latino, a Hispanic Latino theology then?
Well, first of all, there are many Hispanic Latino theologies. and there should be. There shouldn't be anybody that says this is Latino theology. Among other things, because we have, a number of us have different issues. There's a whole feminine issue that is crucial. As you know, there are all kinds of problems, cultural problems and traditions in our communities that have to be overcome by the power of the gospel. Mm-hmm. And so there's an issue there, an issue with which I'm very sympathetic, but which is not one of which I work constantly. Mm-hmm. So I should begin by saying that there are many different Hispanic theologians. There are people who are trying to figure out how an immigrant becomes something else. In other words, how a Brazilian becomes a Latino in the U.S., right. Or how a Dominican becomes a U.S. Latina. Mm-hmm. That's one kind of issue. Mm-hmm. Then there are people who grew up in this country, mm-hmm. Who have a completely different issue. The question is, how do I go back to my roots? How do I discover those roots? So in many ways, what's happening in Latino theology is sort of a coming and going. You have people from Latin America trying to figure out what it means to be Hispanic in the U.S. or Brazilian in the U.S., whatever, Latino, Latina, and you find people from the U.S. trying to find out what it means to have something Brazilian back there, or something Dominican or Cuban or whatever, Mexican back there. So I think those are two very interesting lines, and I think as they come together, that's one of the things that's beautiful about this program we are now, that here you're going to find people who can hardly speak Spanish and people who can hardly speak English.
That's right.
And they're trying to find out, each of them is trying to find out what that means for who they are and where they are and so on. So I think that's one of the crucial issues. Obviously, there are many issues that we have to deal with: immigration, unemployment, school dropouts, lack of educational opportunities, the consequences of poverty on education, the consequences of poverty on family life, family breakup, how that relates, how those relate one to the other.